remember the movie The Lion King? Hakuna Matata, right? We're not going to talk about the circle of life today, but I do want to share with you a quote. And actually, I've never seen the entire movie from beginning to end, all right? Thank you, YouTube, all right? But here's the quote. Simba, he asked, "Dad, don't we eat the antelopes?" Anybody remember this scene? And if you're familiar with the movie, what does Dad say? Dad responds, "Well, first we eat the antelopes, and then we die, and our bodies become fertilizer for the grass, which is eaten by antelopes." Now, isn't that a wonderful thing? No, it's not a wonderful thing that we all become fertilizer and there is no purpose other than to become dirt again for something else. That's not what God has built us for. And what we discover here as we wrap up this really the story of two sons and their father, is that you and I, we are created for something so much more. We're created for something that we know as home. Everybody say that word with me, home. Now imagine with me your perfect place that you would call home. It might not be your physical home, but a place that you would call home. And you can imagine the sights and the smells, the sounds and the feelings, all the feels kind of get to you. It's a place where you can be yourself. It's a place where you can be truly you. It's a place that fits you and suits you. It's a place where you can be understood. It's a place where you feel accepted and loved. We could say it's a place of beauty, a place of completeness, where all your longings are fulfilled. Question, do you have a place like that? It's interesting, Barna, who does major research all around the world, and specifically here in the United States, actually say that less than 18% of Americans have a place where they would truly, authentically call home. That's down and continues to go down year after year after year. And what they're discovering is that the pace of our lives, the pace of our world, the realities of life, the ups and downs, the highs and lows, have cornered us in a place where very few people have very few places that we can call home. And yet home is the place here in the story where the younger brother returns, right? It's the place where the older son has never really left. It's the place where the father invites and runs out to both sons and throws a feast in a home. In a home. But we kind of know the storyline, right? In Genesis, it starts out in a home. Think about it like this. It starts out in a home called the Garden of Eden. It's a perfect place where women and men were equals. There wasn't this inequality. There was, in a sense, justice for all. They lived in perfect harmony, all right? It's kind of like trolls. Perfect harmony. Wow, I'm on a roll today. But it was perfection. There was no disease. There was no aging. There were no wrinkles. There was no cancer. There was no broken marriages. There were no broken families. Kids didn't run off and do their own thing. Parents didn't make bonehead decisions. And even though there wasn't a parenting handbook, it seemed like every mom and every dad knew exactly what to do. Of course, God was in the center of that home, and God planted a tree to remind them of its presence right there in the middle of their home. And it was a place where women and men and children and people of all ages could come together and they could be themselves. They were themselves. They could run and not become weary. And yet they knew how to rest as well. Of course, sin enters the world and it shatters and it breaks. And now we have sibling rivalries. We have Cain and Abel, the first sort of sibling rivalry. We have husbands and wives at each other vying for really control over each other, and that's really what we see in marriages today is our fights really aren't about paint colors and carpet colors. It's really about who has control over each other, and the truth is, in the perfect home, in the perfect Garden of Eden, it's a shared responsibility. It's not like one is over the other in that sense. That's a whole nother sermon. But we see relationships just falling apart. The relationship with the world is falling apart, where we see the misuse of land, the misuse of crops, that which was set aside for for things of God were not being set aside for things of God, and so things began to rot and decay. Animals became distant from humans, and we see that animals actually become hostile toward other animals and other human beings as well. Everything falls apart outside of this perfect home. It might feel like a lot like you might feel about your home. If you have your experience with your family or with your friends, with your workplaces, the relationships have slipped away. And we know it all too well. I mean, even the saints of old, they knew they were homesick. They knew that what they were experiencing was not what it was created to be. They put it like this in the book of Hebrews, okay? Book of Hebrews, chapter 11. These people, they all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar. They acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. You feel it? The younger son and the older son, they're both exiled. They're both apart from home. They're both away from home. One is physically away from home because he squandered, he left, and he did his own thing. The other is far from home, not because he's physically moved away, but his heart is far from it. And we talked about that last week. You can log on and to our website and listen to that message. But the question we want to really wrestle with in just the few moments we have together here is how do we find our way back home? How do we get ourselves back to what God intended us to be? You see, in this story of the two sons, somebody had to pay the price. Let me just read to you a couple of the verses. Now the older son, as he was coming near, he heard music and dancing, and he called one of his servants and asked, "What do these things mean?" "Your brother has come," he said. "Your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him safe and sound." A little before then, the father said to his servants when he saw them, "Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let us eat and celebrate." Question, whose robe was it? Who did the ring belong to? Who did the shoes belong to? Whose feast was this? And many of us, we would say automatically, well, it was the Father's, of course, right? It was the Father's. But you see, if you were a Pharisee or tax collector or one of the other folks listening in, you would have tracked through the story. And you would have caught that when the father divided up his property at the very beginning, remember that? Divided up the property at the very beginning. He divided all of it. A third went to the younger son, and 2/3 went to the older son. So how much of the property did the father have now? None. So let's revisit the question. Whose robe, whose ring, whose shoes, whose party, whose calf was this? It was the older son's. Was the older son. Somebody had to pay to welcome the younger prodigal, the younger son, back into the family. Somebody had to pay the price for this family to come back together. And here we begin to see, and Jesus, it's kind of like a sock in the face to everyone who is listening in, saying, "Don't you get it? Don't you get it?" Ed Clowney tells a story. It's a true story of a young soldier returning from Vietnam, and the young soldier was fighting, and his younger brother was lost in action. So you can imagine two brothers, they were separated, and the amount of fear and grief as he returned home, the family was grieving. They didn't have closure. And so they did everything they could through official channels, through the government, through other sort of methods to figure out what happened to this lost son. But they found nothing. So the older brother, he took everything he had. He got on a plane from the United States and went to Vietnam. And he went from village to village through some really dangerous places, through the jungle itself, searching for his younger brother. And if you do your history research, you can find stories and magazine articles and newspaper clippings, books about what they would call simply the brother. And in that story, not even the tribal villages that would have been hostile toward the white man bothered him. The government didn't interfere because they were all in awe of his quest. You see, the true older brother in the story of the two brothers and their father, the older brother, it would have been his responsibility to go out and seek out the lost son, the younger brother, to keep the family together. He would have had to say something like, Father, my younger brother, he's playing the part of the fool. He doesn't really know what he's doing, even though it seems like he's making his own decisions. He's out of his mind. I will go at my expense. I will pay the price. I will pay out of my own money, out of my own inheritance to bring him back. And of course, he doesn't. Instead, he stays home thinking he's doing the right thing, and now he's finding himself outside the party. And if you notice here, I'm going to read you another verse at the very end of the story. What Jesus says, what the Father says, rather. He says, Son, you are always with me. In other words, you never left. I never left you either. You're always with me, and all that is mine is yours. Don't you see? Everything you have, it was mine to begin with, and I gave it to you. You have everything you needed to go and search out this lost son. And so when he returned, it was fitting to celebrate and be glad. For this brother was dead and is alive, is lost and is now found. You see, in order for the Pharisees and the people listening into this story to really understand what Jesus' entire point was, he needed to share this little section of the story. That we all need a true older brother to seek us out. We all need to be part of a family that has an older sibling who will, at their expense, bring us back. And you see, if you follow the story, we have the perfect older brother, do we not? We have the perfect older brother in Jesus Christ. The father who couldn't bring back the prodigal at his own expense, he sends his only son, the one and only son, the older brother, your older brother and my older brother, to die on a cross at his expense. It cost Jesus everything. He even said it himself, foxes have holes and the birds of air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. And so he wanders in the wilderness with nothing. Until that final week when he comes down to Jerusalem. We're going to start this next weekend. We're going to start the Mount of Olives and walk to the cross, to the empty tomb. But this is how all the story is being played out, how it's being fulfilled. And he's brought to outside the gates of Jerusalem, and he's placed on a cross. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he's all alone. You see, the one who has been lost from home is sent away so that you and I who are lost from home might be brought back. You see how that works? Martin Luther would call this the great exchange. And so we have to ask the question, what difference does that make for us today? And can there be, as we continue to live with our highs and lows throughout the days and the weeks that we have together here on earth, is there a way that we can experience just a taste of home? Because we know how the story ends, right? Jesus comes back, or we die and we wait for Jesus to come back. Either way, Jesus comes back and he brings us home. Home. We know how the story ends. So between now and then, what do we do? Is there a way to experience that? Well, there is. And we have it right here in this story. And if we don't really focus on it, we'll miss it. You see, in ancient times, life revolved around a meal. In today's life in the Fox Valley, wherever you might be joining us, it's kind of fast food, fast everything. If we can't eat it in 10 minutes, then it's too long, right? But you go to other cultures, even around the world today, and certainly in Jesus' time, meals would have taken hours, if not days. To sit around a table, it would have been good for both the soul, but also for the body. To let the food digest, to allow the center of the family, the center of the community to revolve around what we eat. And then, of course, the meal ends, and for those of us who cook in our homes, we have to do the dishes, or maybe we do the dishwasher thing. But for the person of faith, a child of God, a daughter of God, a son of God, Jesus, he comes to take us home again, and he promises to wipe every tear from our eyes, and yet not yet, and yet he gives us a meal to give us just a little taste of what is to come. He talks about this in the prophet Isaiah. It's up here on the screen. He says, "On this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food, rather, for all people. It's a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. On this mountain, he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all people, the sheets that cover all nations." Let's read this next line together. "He will swallow up death forever." So are we getting the picture? At this table, this is what happens. There's great wine. There's great meat, there's great food, all right? And yet death is swallowed up forever. It goes on, "The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces," so there's no tears at this meal, "and he will remove the disgrace from his people from all the earth." So everything that is broken on earth will be made right. And then a little later on, he tells his disciples this. Let's read it together. "People will come from the east and the west and the north and the south. They will take their place at the feast in the kingdom of God." Brothers and sisters of our older brother Jesus, do you believe that's your future? That heaven isn't just a bunch of clouds in the sky where we become angels with wings and playing harps and we have Tom and Jerry running around trying to beat each other up. But the heaven, at the center of the heavenly experience is this table with a meal that never ends, with Jesus as the host sitting right there in the host spot saying, "Come, child, eat." And in fact, that's what we have right here in this story, right? The father, it is the best day of his life. He invites the entire community around him, "Come, celebrate. The lost has been found. Come and eat." And they all come, except for this older brother who's invited still. But he actually doesn't see himself as lost, somebody who's actually invited to the feast. As a pastor, this concerns me at times, probably more often as I get older and further into ministry, that we can talk about becoming a more faithful disciple. We can talk about reading our Bibles. We can talk about prayer. We can talk about a bunch of things. But if we don't begin wrestling with whether or not this promise is ours, that we are actually the lost ones, regardless of what kind of life that we have lived, that we are all lost and invited to the feast. And if we don't grab a hold of that promise, that is our future, maybe we're missing something. Maybe we're just holding on to a promise that is in our imaginations of heaven being a really nice place and yet not home. Think of the best experience that you've ever had when you've come together around a meal. It might have been Christmas or Thanksgiving. It might have been a party. Now close your eyes and imagine if that experience would transfer over into the throne room of God. You hear the songs, "Holy, holy, holy, worthy is the Lamb who was slain, who was and is to come." You smell the food. You feel his presence. You experience the love. You almost can feel the kisses that he is lavishing on you. You taste the food as you place it into your mouth. And with one bite, every desire is satisfied. If that was the experience you had to look forward to, what kind of person would you become today? I believe it would create in us a different type of boldness to step out in faith. I believe that it would create in us a heart that looks more and more like Jesus, with a quiet confidence and not a loud uproar. I believe it would begin looking like those who have lost hope would receive this seed of what life could be, even though it's not what we experience or what we see in the present moment. I believe that we wouldn't freak out about the little things in life, but rather keep our eyes focused on the future and the world that God desires to build, not just the world that we find ourselves living in. If the relationships around us break, and they will break, that's the reality of this life. That we know that the ultimate outcome of every broken marriage, of every lost and wayward child and parent, of every hard decision that we think we might have gotten wrong, will be all sewn up and mended when we sit next to that very person at the meal table in the presence of God. What a different world would that look like? What kind of different world could we as God's people begin to live out and create with this simple vision and picture of a feast that each of us are invited to? And of course, Jesus, he does give us a way to experience that just a little bit in part. We call it the Lord's Supper. We're going to celebrate it here in just a few moments. And we also call it Holy Communion. Everybody say communion with me. Communion. The word there, you can kind of hear community, communal. It's a family meal. It's a community meal. It's as if God is saying through this story, through the person and work of Jesus Christ, that you cannot be shaped by my love unless you do it together. You cannot be grabbing onto the promise of your salvation and fully understand it unless you do it together. You cannot grow in your faith. You cannot eat together. You cannot study together. You cannot learn together. You cannot pray together or confess together. You cannot experience the depth of my love unless you do it together. Because ultimately, that's where we're all heading, around the same table. In the throne room of God. Part of this message is that the Lord's Supper, it's part of our life together. And oftentimes I think we fall into this sort of American way of thinking where it's like me and Jesus time, and as long as me and Jesus are good, we're good. But what this story begins to unravel and shape and form in our lives is that it's not just only about the Father's relationship with each individual son. It's about the relationship as a community, as a family, as a whole. And the power that has, not just on a local family, a local household, but on an entire community that is looking in. So today, as we receive communion, as we come up to the table, as we eat the bread, as we drink the wine, we don't do this very often. I don't believe. At least I don't see it. Instead of looking downward, all right, and I get it. It's a posture of reverence. I get it. But maybe today we look into somebody else's eyes as we come on up. That we smile. That we might even talk to each other as we go back and say, "Wow, glad you're here, brother. Glad you're here, sister." What if that became more of a picture of heaven than living at just a collection of individual lives together? And what sort of power could God do through an entire body, an entire family of people that he's placed on earth for a purpose that we are yet desiring to discover? But ultimately we know he's leading us where? Home. Let's stand.